It still doesn't make sense. Imagine building your franchise around a 25-year-old superstar. A player already ranked top 3 in MVP voting. A player averaging nearly a 30-point triple-double. Someone who wants to stay. Who loves the city. Who's carrying your franchise to NBA Finals runs earlier than expected. And then, you trade him. This isn't a bad decision. This is franchise malpractice. And it's exactly what the Dallas Mavericks just did. We've reached a point where the Mavericks front office has gone from smart, strategic decision-making to what can only be described as self-sabotage. And at the center of it all, General Manager Nico Harrison and new owner Patrick Dumont, two men who have somehow managed to turn a championship contending team into a full-blown circus. Let's rewind for a second. Just a year ago, Dallas was riding high. Luka Doncic was being talked about in the same breath as LeBron, Steph, and Jokic. Nico Harrison was praised for pulling off smart moves, bringing in Derek Lively, P.J. Washington, and Daniel Gafford. All those decisions helped fuel a finals run, even if they got blown out by the Celtics. And what was the reaction from the front office? Let's build on this. That's what everyone expected. You have a generational player, a core that's still developing, and a city behind you. Fans were excited. Media was buying in. The Mavericks were supposed to be loading up to go even deeper. But instead, they flipped the script, completely. Out of nowhere, Luka was traded. Gone. Sent to the Los Angeles Lakers. And with that one move, the entire direction of the franchise changed. Fans were left stunned. Analysts were speechless. Even insiders were left wondering, who made this decision? It didn't take long for the blame game to start. From everything we've heard, Nico Harrison wasn't even the architect of this disaster. The trade came from above, enforced by owner Patrick Dumont. But guess what? It doesn't matter who gave the order. The front office still executed it. And now the franchise is stuck holding the bag. The worst part? Luka didn't want to leave. He didn't demand a trade. He wasn't fed up with the fans. In fact, he loved being in Dallas. When he returned for the tribute video, wiping away tears, you could see it on his face. This was a player who thought he'd spend his entire career here. But the Mavericks made a different choice, a terrible one. And if you think it couldn't get worse than trading Luka, think again. This wasn't a rebuild. This wasn't strategic planning. This was panic. This was mismanagement. This was the moment the Mavericks stopped being a serious franchise. Just when you thought the Luka Doncic trade was the low point, the Dallas Mavericks said, "Hold my Gatorade." Because what followed was not just another mistake, it was a total collapse in judgment. A trade so short-sighted, so lopsided, it made even casual fans do a double-take. We're talking about the infamous Quentin Grimes for Caleb Martin deal, a transaction that feels more like a parody of NBA front office incompetence than a real-life move. So let's break it down. The Mavericks sent Quentin Grimes, a promising young guard who was starting to come into his own, to the Philadelphia 76ers. Along with him, a 2025 second-round pick, which would go on to become the 35th overall selection, a high-value slot that often produces real NBA contributors. And what did Dallas get back? Caleb Martin, a 28-year-old role player on a long-term contract, with a recent history of injuries and clear signs of regression. Now look, Caleb Martin had his moments in Miami. No doubt. He was gritty. He played hard. But you're not trading away a rising talent and a valuable draft pick for a gritty vet who's played just 14 games since joining the Mavs. That's not a trade. That's setting your future on fire and tossing marshmallows over the flames. Here's what makes it worse. When asked why this deal was made, GM Nico Harrison gave an answer that was, well, let's just say it sounded like he was making it up on the spot. His reasoning? It was really about getting Caleb Martin. It was less about Quentin Grimes. Let that sink in. You gave up a better, younger player, plus a top-tier second-round pick, for a veteran with injury concerns, because it wasn't about Grimes. That's not logic. That's evasion. And Tim Cato of The Athletic called him out, multiple times. He pressed, asking why the Mavericks attached a pick to the deal. Harrison's answer? Just as vague. Well, if you don't like Caleb, then you're not going to like the trade. No, Nico. This isn't about liking a player. This is about value. It's about vision. It's about team building, something that, at this point, the Mavericks front office clearly isn't doing. To make matters worse, Grimes flourished in Philly. The man went from averaging 10 points per game in Dallas to 22 points per game with the Sixers, on 47% shooting. He unlocked his offensive game, stepped up on defense, and showed he could be a cornerstone piece for a developing squad. Meanwhile, Caleb Martin's role in Dallas became non-existent. His production dropped, his health remained a question mark, and his contract now looks like a burden that will haunt the team through at least 2028, with a player option to make things worse. And remember, the second-round pick that Dallas gave up in this trade? It could have been used to draft a cost-controlled contributor, a defensive specialist, a floor spacer, even a project big. Instead, it's gone. To recap, Dallas trades a young, improving guard, adds a high-value pick to sweeten the deal, receives a struggling veteran who barely plays, ends up with nothing to show for it but regret. And yet, when questioned again, multiple times, Nico Harrison just doubled down. He kept insisting they believed in Caleb Martin. He made it sound like this trade was about fit, timing, or defensive identity. But here's the thing, belief doesn't win games. Logic does. Vision does. And the Mavericks showed neither. In fact, it gets even more ridiculous when you realize the only reason Dallas got a pick back in the deal at all, a 2030 second-rounder, was because Martin failed his physical due to a hip concern. The Sixers added that pick as a consolation. That wasn't part of the original plan. Nico Harrison was fully ready to make this deal with no pick coming back at all. Let that settle. The Grimes trade isn't just bad. It's a perfect snapshot of how disconnected this front office has become. No long-term plan. No respect for asset management. No accountability. And if you're wondering whether it ends here, the answer is, not even close. Because as this chaos unfolded, media started pressing even harder. Reporters wanted answers. Fans wanted logic. And what they got from Nico Harrison was a masterclass in dodging responsibility. You know what's worse than making a bad decision? Defending it with zero logic. And that's exactly what the Dallas Mavericks front office has been doing ever since the Luka Doncic and Quentin Grimes trades blew up in their faces. Instead of accountability, we got excuses. Instead of strategy, we got word salad. And leading the charge? None other than General Manager Nico Harrison. Let's talk about how this man has handled the media, or more accurately, fumbled every question thrown his way. It started with a press conference after the Luka trade, a moment that should have been filled with clarity. A moment for leadership. But what fans saw was something else entirely. Harrison looked visibly uncomfortable. Head coach Jason Kidd sat next to him, barely able to make eye contact with the crowd. It looked like a hostage situation, not a confident explanation of a bold franchise move. Then came the interviews. The questions were sharp, because they had to be. Mavericks fans wanted answers. And journalists like Tim McMahon and Christian Clark weren't going to let Harrison off the hook easily. One of the most damning moments. You created a 3 to 4 year timeline to build a finals team. Then you traded away your star player. And now, you're out of your first-round picks in 2027, 2028, 2029, and 2030. How does that make any long-term sense? A simple question, right? But Harrison's response? Can you repeat that? Bro. What? This isn't a complex economic model. This is basketball 101. You gave away draft capital for years, right after trading away the very player who made you a finals team. The math doesn't add up. The vision doesn't exist. And yet, Harrison kept repeating the same robotic line. Defense wins championships. He said it again and again, like it was a magical phrase that would erase reality. Never mind that Luka led the team to the finals the year before. Never mind that the trades they made weakened the team's defensive core. When pressed further, Harrison gave even less substance. Once we win, your mind will change. No. That's not how this works. Winning isn't a shield for terrible decision-making. If anything, it's a reason to double down on what works, not throw it away. Tim McMahon asked him straight up. You didn't think the team that just made the finals, with Luka as the centerpiece, could continue contending? And Harrison's response? I'll say it again, defense wins championships. That's not an answer. That's a deflection. And at this point, it's almost insulting. Look, fans aren't asking for miracles. They're asking for logic. For a plan. For a front office that can explain the why behind each move. But what we've seen is a GM who dances around questions like he's dodging defenders in transition, except there's no finish at the rim. It's not just the content of his answers, it's the tone, too. Harrison comes across like someone who's been cornered. Not someone who's confident in the direction he's taking the team. And when a journalist finally cornered him on the Grimes trade, asking why they gave up a high-value second-round pick for a player who barely plays, Harrison actually said, "We valued Caleb more. And we got a second-rounder back." But here's the truth. That second-rounder wasn't even in the original deal. It was thrown in last minute because Caleb Martin failed his physical. That's not smart negotiating, that's damage control. And the pick they got back. It's a 2030 second-rounder, which could literally end up being the last pick in that draft. Meanwhile, the pick they gave up to Philly? The 35th pick in 2025. A pick with real potential. So let's recap this media circus. Harrison can't clearly explain why Luka was traded. He can't justify the loss of long-term draft capital. He refuses to accept that the Grimes deal was a complete blunder. And when asked about the logic behind any of it, he defaults to defense wins championships. This isn't leadership. This is damage control by someone clearly out of his depth. And now the Dallas Mavericks are stuck with the consequences. A roster full of question marks, an ownership that seems disconnected from reality, and a front office that keeps pretending everything's fine, while the house burns around them. But believe it or not, it still gets worse. So far, we've seen poor trades. We've seen a GM who can't explain his own decisions. But now we reach the final, and maybe most disturbing part of the Dallas Mavericks collapse. The ownership's complete detachment from reality. Because after trading away a 25-year-old generational star, a player who carried the franchise to the NBA Finals, who never wanted to leave, the Mavericks leadership still somehow thought fans would be okay with it. That people would just move on, accept it, trust the process. And how did they try to sell this to the public? With comparisons that were so mind-blowingly bad, so historically tone-deaf, you'd think they came from a parody account on Twitter. Let's start with team governor Patrick Dumont. The man actually stood in front of the media and said this: "I'm a big Luka fan. My family loves Luka. I appreciate what he brought to this team and to Dallas. As far as I'm concerned, Luka is a Mav for life." Wait, what? You traded him. You don't get to call someone a Mav for life after you send him packing to LA. Luka didn't leave because of free agency. He didn't demand a trade. You shipped him out. That's like breaking up with someone and saying, "But you'll always be my soulmate." It's delusional. And then, oh boy, things got even worse. Mavericks CEO Suente Marshall reportedly tried to rationalize the trade by comparing it to the 2012 Golden State Warriors, specifically when they traded Monta Ellis for Andrew Bogut. Let that sink in. They compared trading away Luka Doncic to trading Monta Ellis. The exact quote: "The Warriors traded Monta Ellis for Andrew Bogut and got better because they had a guard named Steph Curry. Curry came in and made the entire fanbase love him." Now, where do we even start? First of all, Steph Curry was already on the Warriors when that trade happened. The whole point of that move was choosing between Monta and Steph. The Warriors kept their generational talent. They didn't trade him away. If anything, this analogy would only make sense if the Warriors had traded Steph and kept Monta. Which they didn't. Because they weren't insane. Second, and this is important, Luka Doncic is not Monta Ellis. He's Steph. He's the generational talent. You don't trade that guy and expect to discover someone else just as good. That's not how basketball works. That's not how dynasties are built. That's how franchises end up in the lottery for a decade. And yet, Dallas ownership seemed completely blind to this. They tried to pull in nostalgic references. Quotes about Kobe, MJ, Bird, and Shaq, as if dropping names of legends would distract fans from the fact that they just gave up their own. And when Dumont tried to relate to fans emotionally, it backfired. Big time. He said, "Look, I really sympathize with fans who feel hurt. I get it. But Luka will always be part of this franchise's story." You know who else is part of a franchise's story? Shaquille O'Neal with the Orlando Magic. Took them to the finals. Beat Michael Jordan's Bulls. Got swept. Left. That's what Luka is now, a footnote in Mavericks history instead of the foundation for the next decade. But don't worry, ownership still thinks this is all just part of some grand plan. They say they're building a defensive identity. They believe in the roster they've created. They want fans to trust the process. But here's the truth. You don't build a defense by trading away your franchise cornerstone. You don't build fan trust by insulting their intelligence. You don't build a legacy by comparing Luka Doncic to Monta Ellis. This isn't a process. This is a cover-up. Because whether they want to admit it or not, the Mavericks blew it. They fumbled the bag. They took one of the most promising futures in the league and threw it away because of ego, impatience, or sheer incompetence. And now, Luka's gone. The fans are furious. The front office is scrambling. And ownership is clinging to analogies that make zero sense. The worst part? There's no easy fix. You can't undo a trade like this. You can't redraft your picks. You can't regain fan trust overnight. And unless they pull off a miracle, like somehow landing Kevin Durant, as Kendrick Perkins half-jokingly suggested, this team is headed for years of regret. This wasn't just a bad offseason. This was the implosion of the Dallas Mavericks identity. And the scariest part? They still don't realize it.